Thanks for tuning in to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast, the dinosaur podcast that features periodic updates recapping the latest news on the dinosaurs. My name's Ryan Rogers, and this is the podcast that targets a type of dinosaur that tries to catch you up on everything that's been published on them lately. Welcome to the 8th of these interstitial episodes I've created to keep up with all the dinosaurs news, even while I'm not publishing new episodes of the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, and I hope it helps you feel more up to date. Welcome to episode 8, Hadrosauroids Part 2, recorded January 27th, 2026. Continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E. Check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Snail's third album is out now. You can find it too on Spotify and Bandcamp. It's called, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, Toyn B, and I've been playing it endlessly because it's super catchy, lots of fun new tracks on there to get stuck in your head. Today's intro is Valentine, and the outro is Destroyer from Snail's brand new third album. Three things before we get into the thick of things. First, I put together a little PDF on ankylosaurs. If you'd like a copy, just send me an email and I'll forward it over to you, no charge. It literally costs you nothing to drop me a line and ask for it. RyanSRogers@gmail.com. Second, if you'd like to request a particular family of dinosaurs to cover for an upcoming episode, please do. I've got an informal schedule I'm keeping, but I can take requests. Third, the last few episodes have been really long, so I've divided this one up to be more bite-sized. If you prefer it this way, let me know. Just a quick email that says, yep, I like it better this way, something like that. I look forward to hearing from you. In today's episode, which nobody asked for, we're catching up on Hadrosauroids. So resuming where we left off from part 1, we've made it into the latest Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian age, spanning from 72.1 to 66 million years ago, where Hadrosauroids were flourishing. Our earlier articles were set in the Campanian age, but our next series of articles focus on the very final 6 million years of the non-avian dinosaurs. The first article is A New Small Duck-Billed Dinosaur from Morocco and Dinosaur Diversity in the Late Maastrichtian of North Africa, published in Scientific Reports in February 2024. In this article, they name a brand new small Lambeosaurine hadrosaur. Recall, Lambeosaurines are the ones with crests, but more specifically, they're members of a fairly new family of Lambeosaurines called Hadrosauroids. The authors describe remains recovered from the phosphates of Sidi Chenin, Morocco, which represent a new Hadrosaurian that they've named Mincaria bata. Hadrosaurine lambeosaurs are crested hadrosaurs from the latest Late Cretaceous from Europe and North Africa, which have been found to be distinct from crested hadrosaurs from the latest Late Cretaceous of North and South America and China. Most specifically, Hadrosaurine lambeosaurs share novel characteristics like the triangular predentary process of the mandible and some specific characters in their jaws and teeth that separate them from other Maastrichtian lambeosaurs. Uniting this tribe helps describe a story of their geographic distribution that is more simple than if they were somehow closely related to Chinese and North American members of the Lambeosaurine family. The authors admit, though, that, quote, more complete remains of the African and European Hadrosaurines are needed to better resolve their systematics. From this paper's perspective, their phylogenetic analysis suggests, quote, Lambeosaurinae initially diversified in Asia, then saw dispersals into North America by Paraspheroolithus and Lambeosaurinae. Dispersal from Asia into Europe was followed by dispersal into North Africa. Multiple dispersals from Europe to Africa seem less parsimonious than a single dispersal, but are not impossible, particularly given the distinctive morphologies of Ajnabia and Mincaria. These names, Ajnabia and Mincaria, are two of these special hadrosaurs named in 2024. The first, Ajnabia, was the first duck-billed dinosaur named in Africa, and Mincaria will be the second. So the name's etymology is pretty simple. Minkar is Arabic for beak, and bata is Arabic for duck, so its name just means duck-bill. The holotype, MHNM.KHG1395, housed at the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle de Marrakech, was uncovered from the Couche 3. It's comprised of a right maxilla with teeth, left dentary and brain case, and in other words, a partial skull. And this is good because elements of the skull are much more diagnostic than elements of the postcranial skeleton. This animal is believed to have been about 10 feet long, making it a small hadrosaur, and it was closely related to the Ajnabia hadrosaur that was its peer in this ecosystem. The authors say, quote, similarities with the European Tyrannosaurus provide further evidence for dispersal of Lambeosaurines between the Ibero-Armorican landmass of Africa. A humerus from Sidi Daoui and a femur from Murat-Larache belong to a larger individual, suggesting at least 3 hadrosaur species occur in the phosphates. Even as Lambeosaurines declined in the Maastrichtian of North America, they diversified in Africa. And why stop with two new Tyrannosaurians from Morocco? The next article was published in September 2025 in the journal Gondwana Research, named "A New Hadrosaurid Dinosaur from the Late Maastrichtian Phosphates of Morocco Provides Evidence for an African Radiation of Lambeosaurines." But we know that it should be named "More Evidence for an African Radiation of Lambeosaurines." This new dinosaur is named Taleta, also from the Late Maastrichtian Phosphates of Morocco, completing the trifecta of presently known Tyrannosaurine Lambeosaurs. It's diagnosed thanks to its large teeth and distinctive jaw shape, suggesting its feeding ecology was distinct from the previously described relatives in the area. The authors say, quote, "The high diversity of Tyrannosaurine Lambeosaurs in the Late Maastrichtian of Morocco is suggestive of dispersal-driven adaptive radiation and shows that Hadrosaurid dinosaurs were highly diverse at this time here. Dispersal-driven radiations likely played a major role in the diversification of dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous." The authors further describe how this dispersal-driven radiation may have been impacted by geographic changes. Quote, "In the late Cretaceous, continental fragmentation and high sea levels created a series of island continents, leading to the evolution of endemic dinosaur faunas on these isolated landmasses. Laramidia saw the emergence of faunas dominated by ornithischian herbivores and tyrannosaurid predators, whereas Gondwana continents were dominated by titanosaurian sauropods and abelosaurid predators." Quote, "However, the end of the Cretaceous also saw exchange between northern and southern assemblages, with titanosaurs immigrating into Laurasia and hadrosaurids invading Gondwana. And of course, the Lambeosaurine hadrosaurid Agenabia odysseus Mincaria bata led to the erection of the Lambeosaurine tribe Tyrannosaurini. But we've covered this already. What's important is, in this article, that there's a new member of the Tyrannosaurini. Taleta is a species and genus name which are the same. Is this uncommon? Sort of, but the examples of organisms that have the same species and genus names are kind of commonly known animals, like iguana is a green iguana, bison, gorilla, and lynx are all self-explanatory, and the vulpes is a red fox, ratus is a black rat, etc. So it's not really uncommon, I guess, but maybe you wouldn't expect it. So Taleta is the name, and it is derived from the Arabic word for three, because this is the third Tyrannosaurian found in this rock formation in North Africa. Its name means third, as a something like that. The holotype MHNMKH1557 is housed at the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle de Marrakech, and it's comprised of an associated left and right maxilla with in situ teeth. Taleta is said to be only about 10 feet long, which is small for a hadrosaur, and I see no mention of any histology work being done, so I can't report as to whether this was a juvenile or not, but the authors do say, quote, "A unique combination of characters, including the autapomorphically large teeth and reduced tooth count, allowed Taleta to be distinguished from the co-occurring Agenabia and Mincaria. The small size of the animal suggests the possibility that the animal might be a juvenile. However, the highly fused brain case of Mincaria showed that this taxon matured at small size, and the absence of any large hadrosaurid remains from Morocco suggests that Moroccan Lambeosaurines all tended to achieve maturity at relatively small sizes. By reviewing the texture of the bones, the authors say, quote, "Even if the holotype of Taleta was immature, it is too large to represent a juvenile of either Agenabia or Mincaria. So they are confident it is in its specificity, even if its maturity is in doubt." Kind of like me. So, what is the macroevolutionary story being told by this novel clade of Tyrannosaurian dinosaurs in North Africa? Quote, "North African hadrosaurids achieved high diversity in a short period of time, suggesting they represented an adaptive radiation that took place near the end of the Cretaceous. It's uncertain when they arrived in Morocco, but because, quote, all known European Lambeosaurines are Maastrichtian in age, and these Lambeosaurines in Morocco probably came from Europe, it's unlikely they came before that. And possibly at the Campanian-Maastrichtian boundary when a, quote, low stand event would have narrowed marine barriers and perhaps exposed land bridges, making dispersal easier. In this scenario, Lambeosaurines existed in North Africa for 6 million years or less, yet still achieved a high diversity of three genera now known, Agenabia, Mincaria, and Taleta. Quote, this is astonishing considering that so far, only 3 diagnostic hadrosaurid specimens are known from Morocco. That each represents a distinct species implies we are sampling a highly diverse fauna. The authors say there are still further jaw fragments that are potentially at least one more distinct larger Lambeosaur species in the fauna too. Our next article is about expanding the geographical limits of known Lambeosaurs, this time into South China. The paper First Occurrence of the Duck-billed Dinosaur Tribe Lambeosaurinae in South China in the journal Historical Biology in January 2025 Not to be confused with the North American Laramidia, Laurasia is obviously the Asian continent during the late Cretaceous, and the authors of this paper describe a typical dinosaur fauna consisting of herbivorous hadrosaurids, ceratopsians, and carnivorous tyrannosauroids. A fragmentary skeleton of a hadrosaur from the Daliangshan Formation of the Guangdong province is named the SHS specimen, and it includes a dorsal and caudal vertebrae, a humerus, ilium, femur, and tibia. And they're described in this paper. There isn't anything especially diagnostic about the fossil, so they've not felt it warrants associating it with an existing species, nor erecting a new species. But, quote, the results of the cladistic analysis show that the SHS specimen occurs within a clade uniting Paraspheroolithus, Lambeosaurinae, and Hadrosaurini into the exclusion of other hadrosaurid taxa. The analysis groups the specimen with hadrosaurs like Hadrosaurus vilafrons and magnipolia, which are North American animals from Alberta, Canada, Coahuila, Mexico, and California, USA, respectively. This suggests that it's less closely related to other known hadrosaurs discovered in this area, hence why it's being described as the first of its kind in the area, where other Lambeosaurine hadrosaurs are not yet known from. Now, the authors have published a correction along with this paper. There had been an error in the data, but it said, quote, this error does not affect the classification results and the conclusions of the original paper. So I think it's safe to continue to say from the results, while Lambeosaurs and also Tyrannosauroid tooth, indicating tyrannosaurs, are relatively unknown in southern Laurasia, they are otherwise known to be dominant taxa of the typical late Cretaceous dinosaur fauna of Laurasia. In other words, it's not surprising to find specimens of the dominant taxa of this time and place. It's just surprising that they're only finding them now. And I suppose they will be expecting to find new evidence, eventually, that continues to reaffirm these animals were also thriving in, quote, the Cretaceous deposits of the Ganzhou Basin, and indicates that this area was once home to a typical late Cretaceous Laurasian dinosaur fauna. We've done articles on beaks and teeth and footprints and tail injuries, and how about one on eggs? The next article is the first discovery of Stromatoolithus pinglingensis of the Ganzhou Basin and a revision of Paraspheroolithus porcarboris from the journal Historical Biology, published in November 2025. This article reports on eggshell fragments for the Tangbian Formation of the Ganzhou Basin in southeastern China, which are characterized by a strongly sculptured outer surface, highly fused spherulitic shells units, well-developed accretion lines, and ovaled around pores through tangential sections. It took some classifying and reevaluations, but the authors came to identify this as Stromatoolithus pinglingensis, which is an eggshell type known from other parts of China, which share similarities in their external ornamentation and pore canal system. Pore in this case being like the pores of your skin. The authors also reviewed the similarities between the Chinese discoveries and a French specimen from the Upper Cretaceous, Argile et gris, a reptile formation called Paraspheroolithus porcarboris, and proposed that it be reassigned as a new species of Stromatoolithus, which are hadrosaur eggs, and if it's redescribed as such, this indicates the first evidence of hadrosaur eggs in France. The authors say that this type of egg, Stromatoolithus, having been excavated from the lower and mid-upper parts of the Tangbian Formation, further reaffirms the chronostratigraphic constraints for this formation, notably further supporting that this rock formation spans from the latest Campanian to the latest Maastrichtian ages. And as we've heard in other articles, the bigger questions of where hadrosaurs come from, where they migrated to, and how they diversified as they discovered new ecological niches are further informed, bit by discoveries like these eggshell fragments. The authors say, quote, the co-occurrence of diverse hadrosaurid skeletal elements, embryonic eggs, and eggshell fragments offers valuable materials for the biogeographic distribution, phylogenetic relationships, community succession, and reproductive biology among late Cretaceous hadrosauroids in southern China. The final three articles are about a single species and some incredible stuff. The first is Edmontosaurus from the Rocky Mountain foothills, Alberta, and its chronostratigraphic position in the Late Cretaceous Brazeau Formation, and correlative units in Western Canada, published in the Canadian Journal of Earth Sciences in October 2025. The fossils the authors describe are from the Bennett bone bed, and they represent the first identified taxon and the first described vertebrate remains from the Brazeau Formation. This formation, it represents a regression, transgression, regression, succession that corresponds to the time-equivalent Belly River Group and the Horseshoe Canyon Formation further east and the Wapiti Formation further northwest. A regression, transgression, regression, succession is interesting, and I think I can explain it. This succession is when the sea level goes down for a while, a regression, during which time depositional sediment goes on top of the seafloor sediments. In this case, it's shallow water sediment on top of deep water sediment. Then the sea level rises again, a transgression. Now, deep water sediments are deposited on top of the shallow water sediments, which are already on top of deep water sediments from before. And you can see that layers now are being built up. Finally, another regression where the sea retreats again, and shallower sediments are deposited on top of the deep water, on top of the shallow water, on top of the deep water. And you get, deep water sediment, then shallow, then deep, then shallow again, and all on top of each other. And it makes for a confusing perspective on the environment unless you know what you're looking at. I guess the Brazeau Formation is a combination of layers of sandstone and mudstone, reflecting the succession of transgressions and regressions. And to make interpretation worse, quote, much of the formation underwent significant structural deformation during Eocene thrust faulting events. However, the Brazeau Formation represents a largely uninterrupted terrestrial succession with no known significant unconformities and provides an opportunity to investigate terrestrial ecosystems and vertebrate diversity during the Campanian and early Maastrichtian. That said, vertebrate remains in this area are relatively unknown. Quote, before this study, the only reported Brazeau Formation vertebrates were tentatively identified as Gorgosaurus teeth and Corythosaurus toe bone. And that was back in the 1940s, which makes any new discovery exciting. And this is a hadrosaur postorbital bone named UALVP 59617, housed at the University of Alberta's Laboratory for Vertebrate Paleontology. It most closely resembles the holotype of Edmontosaurus regalis. What does it mean that an Edmontosaurus species has been found in this Brazeau Formation? Edmontosaurus is known well in the area from the late Campanian and early Maastrichtian, about 73 to 71.5 million years ago, in the species Edmontosaurus regalis, and then there's no sign of Edmontosaurus in the fossil record again until the late Maastrichtian, which is 67.5 to 66 million years ago, where they discovered Edmontosaurus annectens, leaving a 4 million year gap where it is hypothesized that Edmontosaurus had extirpated from, or it was eliminated in this area, even though there were species surviving elsewhere in the world. So this discovery, however, offers a glimpse that a species of Edmontosaurus was present around the 70 million year mark, in the midst of that gap in the fossil record. The authors say, quote, these new specimens from the Bennett bone bed provide sufficient evidence that the genus Edmontosaurus persisted in Alberta well into the Maastrichtian. Continued exploration of the Brazeau Formation may provide evidence of the origin of Edmontosaurus annectens, they add. All right, this next article, also about Edmontosaurus, is published in the journal Science. It's in the October 2025, called Duck-billed Dinosaur Fleshy Midline and Hooves Reveal Terrestrial Clay Template Mummification. In this article, the authors talk about the front feet of this Edmontosaurus specimen, which they describe as hooves. I don't have access to the article itself, but found an excellent blog, Prehistoric Beast of the Week, who also made Edmontosaurus its feature beast on November 29, 2025. And this is run by Christopher Di Piazza, and he appears to be an incredibly talented illustrator as well as dinosaur educator and probably educator in general. In any case, Mr. Di Piazza's blog has a few pics of these Edmontosaurus feet, and he summarizes, quote, the large hoof encompasses the middle three fingers, so you can see the fine scaly skin and folds on the wrists. The article concludes saying that the mummification happened, quote, after drought-induced mortality. So it happens in 4 stages. Carcass desiccation and initial subaerial decay, sudden burial with minimal transport, rapid carcass infilling, and templating in clay and final decay. They add that the, quote, integument renderings of these dinosaur mummies congealed early in the process of fossilization as a thin external clay mask, a templating process documented only in anoxic marine settings. And this final article is the crown jewel of dinosaur articles, in my opinion, even if what it's describing sort of resembles the family jewels. But I digress. Published in the Journal of the Anatomical Record in May 2025 is the article Re-evaluation of a Soft-Crested Edmontosaurine with Implications for Hadrosaurid Life Appearance and Diversity. We know that the difference between Saurolophines and Lambeosaurines is that one is crested and one is not, which is based on the presence of or absence of a bony cranial crest. Quote, at least one supposedly non-crested hadrosaur is known to have possessed a soft tissue cranial crest, or comb, based on an exceptionally preserved mummified specimen, say the authors. This specimen is called UALVP 53722, housed at the University of Alberta's Laboratory for Vertebrate Paleontology, which was first described in 2014 as a specimen of Edmontosaurus regalis, recall from our first article. This is potentially late Campanian age species of Edmontosaurus. Its comb was described as a, quote, large dome, approximately 20 centimeters dorsoventrally tall by 33 centimeters antero-posteriorly long, covered in uniform scales and wrinkled and undulating areas. It was described as, quote, clear evidence that at least some non-crested Hadrosauridae indeed possessed soft tissue crests that would have drastically affected their appearance in life, but might only fossilize under exceptional circumstances. It's said to be a small, rounded dome sitting atop the posterior part of the skull roof. In this paper, the authors redescribed the specimen and identify new features of the skeleton and integument. And integument, you recall, is whatever's covering your flesh, like hair, scales, horns, scutes, spines, feathers, filaments, and stuff like that. They say the comb, quote, covered most of the skull roof. It appears to have a crenellated interior margin. And that's a mouthful. Crenellated means to be sort of jagged, like the top of a castle wall with the high and low bits that soldiers hid behind when they fired arrows. You know what I mean? Think like the very basic teeth of a jack-o'-lantern as well. Interior margins on the skull are kind of like around your forehead. So you can think like the top front. So the top front of this comb was crenellated. In the figures associated with the paper, this comb is way up at the top of the skull behind the eyes, and the comb isn't really jagged. It's like wrinkly, like you might imagine like the knee of an elephant might be. Rough, lumpy bumps like that is sort of what the front of this comb might have looked like. So the comb covered most of the skull roof, almost like a little toque you might wear in the winter, and the top front of the comb was crenellated like the wrinkles of a knee of an elephant. Now, it was previously suggested this was Edmontosaurus regalis, but these authors are saying that this, quote, warrants the recognition of this specimen as a distinct taxonomic unit from the existing Edmontosaurus species, which we designate the red willow Edmontosaurine. But they confess the material is, quote, insufficient for holotype status, so they won't officially name this as a new species, but recognize that it's unique from other known existing species. The paper says that this comb has several convergences with modern bird combs, too. This animal has a single median rounded comb with a possibly crenellated anterodorsal margin, which extends to the lateral sides of the skull roof. And these shapes are seen in, quote, different domestic chicken breeds, which are in general more elaborate than those observed in UAL VP 53722. These combs are also present in some vultures, tropical wading birds, and waterfowl, and in some ducks and chickens. The combs on vultures, wading birds, and waterfowl are, quote, generally simpler in morphology, and therefore more similar to UAV LP 53722 than the galliform counterparts, which would be the geese, chickens, and ducks. So based on that observation, perhaps these combs are not as ornate as what you see in geese and chickens, and more basic, like in some vultures, wading birds, and waterfowl. Apart from saurophines, the authors took a moment to comment on lambeosaur crests too. Lambeosaurs are distinctive from saurophines because of their bony crests, and that compares better with cassowaries. The authors say that while cassowaries grow, quote, thick layers of keratin over the supporting bones, vessels in the grooves, and foramina may provide the requisite blood supply for the growing keratin forced to penetrate or excavate the bone surface by the sheath-like nature of the integumentary cover. But lambeosaurs lack these grooves in their crests. They are mostly smooth in texture, so perhaps they weren't exasperated to the extent that a cassowary's crest is by keratin growth. So a Paraspheroolithus may not have had additional keratin branching off of it necessarily. The evidence doesn't correlate. But back to Edmontosaurus's crest, the authors conclude by saying, quote, wattles and combs in living birds are variable among species and can be sexually dimorphic within species. The comb morphology of UALVP 53722 cannot be extrapolated to other members of its own species with full confidence, let alone other hadrosaurid taxa. The different structures on the comb of UALVP 53722, ridges, raised bumps, in addition to the wide variety of possible color phenotypes that could have been expressed on the comb in life, speak to a diversity of soft tissue phenotypes available to hadrosaurid dinosaurs. So Hadrosauroids, to recap. A new ancestor to the hadrosaurs was named from fossils that were first collected from South America, giving us, however belated, the new species Tietasaura derbiana from Brazil. Though scarce, ornithischians from Cretaceous Brazil are important, even if it's just based on a piece of left femur. In a broad perspective, it demonstrates the correlations between South America and Africa during the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary. Then, an investigation into neonatal hatchlings, Myosaura peoplesorum, research suggests that they may have required 40 to 75 days of mothering after they hatched. And using the same research inferences, the authors believe Hypacrosaurus stabingeri likely left the nest at a much earlier age. Their hypothesis is that different hadrosaurs probably had different speeds at maturing, which probably gave them an advantage when it came to succeeding in their worldwide distribution. As we can all imagine, the one-size-fits-all strategy probably doesn't adapt well, so having diversity of reproductive strategies would have allowed hadrosaurs to reproduce in contrasted environments during the Cretaceous. We learned that in Mexico, the coexistence of diverse species of hadrosauroids in the Cerro de Pueblo Formation, Coahuila Campanian, indicates high interactive complexity within the community due to the diverse structural habitats and trophic guilds among hadrosauroids in the area. And niche partitioning can be inferred either by seasonal, sexual, or habitat differences, or through periodical seasonal movements, suggesting that two or more species were interacting and potentially interbreeding. The microstructure analysis of the Juras-Sick fossils showed that large late Cretaceous ornithischians were really different from Saurischians, specifically in that they did not evolve the bone pneumaticity that is prevalent in large theropods and sauropods. This preliminary observation calls into question the respiratory evolution of ornithischians, how they might have adapted to body mass differently than Saurischians, even the phylogenetic relationships between Silosaurus and the connections to the origins of ornithischians way back in the late Triassic. And there's an informal link mentioned between how contemporary large animals use similar bone structures for energy reserves during migration and fasting periods. Perhaps hadrosaurs were doing something similar. That's a fun speculative element the paper brings up. In the Dinosaur Park Formation, a comparison between Corythosaurus and Gyriposaurus demonstrated that the resource partitioning between hadrosaurids was size-mediated. Larger hadrosaurines like Gyriposaurus had stronger bites than Lambeosaurines like Corythosaurus, giving them a wider diet breadth, but only because they were a bit bigger, not necessarily because their jaw musculature was specialized in any specific way, only that they were, by sheer elements of scale, larger than its co-eval Lambeosaurine counterparts in the Dinosaur Park Formation. This was identified thanks to the authors performing complete abductor muscle reconstructions during their finite element analysis, which I suppose was essential to making these observations. So, they emphasized that this was important to reach those conclusions. A new species of saurophine hadrosaur from New Mexico, Ashislasaurus womani, is potentially indicative of a new clade of flat-headed saurophine hadrosaurs, and that hadrosaurs were a taxonomically diverse group, which lasted the final 20 million years of the Cretaceous, placing them among the dominant herbivorous dinosaurs in southern Laramidia. And then there's the story of Tridigicnus in Opinatus, the three-toed track they didn't expect to find. It's a slab with possibly hadrosaur tracks on it from an Argentinian quarry that was used to pave a sidewalk back in the 1970s. It's a quirky story, but it doesn't really advance our understanding of hadrosaurs especially far, does it? We had a study that identified a recurring series of injuries on the high tail of hadrosaurs, and the authors are fairly sure these are mating injuries from bulls mounting young females during breeding season. All species need to eat, drink, move, avoid predators, and reproduce, and based on the current state of knowledge, the only one of these activities that could feasibly result in potentially recurrent and survivable injuries is mating, say the authors. And as a primal and rough as this observation is, the authors think this is an important observation because it may signal a new way of inferring the sex of a hadrosaur, while also furthering an understanding of the dinosaur mating process. In Maastrichtian age North Africa, a greater diversity of hadrosaurs is being described, beginning in 2024 with Ajnabia, and followed closely by Mincaria, and then a new clade of Arenisaurine Lambeosaurus, beginning to tell a macroevolutionary story where a dispersal of hadrosaurs from Asia into Europe was followed by a dispersal into North Africa, as indicated by this growing family of hadrosaurs that have distinctive snouts and jaws. With a combination of Ajnabia, Mincaria, and Teleta, the disparate jaw and tooth morphology suggests niche partitioning in North Africa, implying different adaptations for processing different plants and a high degree of dietary specialization. Teleta, in particular, had fewer, larger teeth than the others, and a limited number of teeth actually participating in food processing suggests an unusual evolutionary process called pedomorphosis, where retention of juvenile characteristics is present in adults. While pedomorphosis isn't universally common, it has been observed in some groups like the finches Charles Darwin wrote about in The Origin of Species, and it may apply to the Arenisaurine lambeosaurs of the Maastrichtian. Quote, this remarkable species richness and the diversity in jaw and tooth morphology is suggestive of a dispersal-driven adaptive radiation such as Darwin's finches. In the Galapagos, finches show high species diversity and a range of beak shapes associated with distinct diets, like insects, small seeds, large seeds, cactus, nectar, and pollen. This adaptive radiation resulted from a finch species colonizing to the Galapagos and finding many niches left unexploited. Over time, different populations specialized on different food types, foraging strategies, and habitats, causing speciation and morphological diversification. The author Nicholas Longrich tells me, concluding that, quote, species richness is the least interesting kind of diversity, but it's way easier to count species than, say, quantified jaw disparity or tooth shapes, which I think they could have done with these three new animals. He says they have a, quote, wider range of shape in three species than maybe all North American lambeosaurs, which is really something if you think about it. As well, a new Lambeosaurine specimen was described from the Ganzhou Basin and indicates that this area was once home to a typical Late Cretaceous Laurasian dinosaur fauna. And while they can't specifically identify it, it is the first Lambeosaurin hadrosaur found in that area so far, and they expect to find more someday. Some new eggshell fragments in China have been collected, and they continue to contribute to the biogeographic distribution, phylogenetic relationships, community succession, and reproductive biology among late Cretaceous hadrosauroids in southern China. They're considered just another piece of the big macroevolutionary puzzle of hadrosaurs. And with regards to the big E, Edmontosaurus, we have lots of news. A new specimen has been found that expands Edmontosaurus' presence in Alberta by many millions of years, filling the gap where it was thought that the species had been extirpated. Another article describes how some Edmontosaurus specimens were mummified, and in particular that it required that the animal die in drought-like conditions, such that the carcass was desiccated in subaerial decay, then buried suddenly with minimal transport and rapid carcass infilling, and templating in clay and final decay. The integument renderings are possible because the mummies congealed early in the process of fossilization as a thin external clay mask, which has only been observed in anoxic marine sediments prior to this description. The hooves of Edmontosaurus suggest that the hoof encompassed the middle three fingers, which bore the weight of the animal. And finally, we had an incredible investigation into the soft tissue comb atop an exceptional mummified specimen of Edmontosaurus from Alberta. The comb would have appeared covered in uniform scales with wrinkled and undulating areas, appearing perhaps similar to a toque at the top of the skull, behind the eyes, providing that some non-crested hadrosaurs possessed soft tissue crests, which would have drastically affected their life appearance. Compared with modern animals, the crest may have been simple, unlike the ornate comb of domestic chickens, for example, and perhaps was more like something on a vulture. The authors concluded by saying it's not yet possible to say whether this was an indication of this being male or female, but according to earlier articles in this episode, perhaps they could correlate this specimen with whether or not the neural spines just behind the hip are smashed, which was suggested earlier to perhaps indicate a female acquiring injuries during the mating process. The paper doesn't really mention much about the postcranial remains, so I don't know if that part is there for them to see or not. But anyhow, after all of that, I hope you feel like you're more caught up on what's been published on Hadrosauroids lately. Thanks for tuning in to Dinosaurs Lately. If you'd like to find links to the materials discussed on today's show, you can visit dinosaurslately.blogspot.com, which is a companion piece to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast. A special thank you to Alberto Reyes, Aaron Vander Reest, and Nicholas Longrich, whom to each I owe a very special thank you for their correspondence while I produced this episode. Thank you to each for their support and congenial interest in sharing their research on dinosaurs. Remember, if you'd be interested in a new PDF on ankylosaurs, drop me a line. If you'd like a copy, just send me an email and I'll forward it over to you, no charge. If you'd like to request a family of dinosaurs to focus on for an upcoming episode, you can drop me a line on that too. How to do that? Listen up. Dinosaurs Lately is a companion show to the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, a podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Juras-Sick Park, and also Not That Tune. If you'd like to be a guest on that show, you can reach me at ryansrogers@gmail.com. These podcasts are part of the Spring Chicken's banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chicken's Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, the Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. And you can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting schickens.blogspot.com. And you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, on X at RogersRyan22, or on Blue Sky at RogersRyan22.bsky.social. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you feel you're more caught up on Hadrosauroids for now. Until next time.